Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another edition of our fortnightly IRENA webinar series, Insight webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons, and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would like to introduce you to IRENA and also to our webinar series. So IRENA is an intergovernmental organization. We have currently 167 member countries, and another 17 countries are in their accession process. We support our members in their transition to a sustainable energy future, and we serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, and also as a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. And because our analytical work and our engagement with our members and also stakeholders generates a lot of valuable insights, we are constantly looking for more ways and different ways how to share those insights with you. And that is why we launch this webinar series, which we run every other week, usually on Tuesdays. We started in January 2020, before the pandemics proliferated many virtual events. And so far we organize more than 30 webinars on various topics. You can check all of them on our IRENA events website, and the link is also shared in the presentation slides. We appreciate that there are many other longer deep dive webinars out there, but what we try to do here is, on contrary, to keep these webinars short. So they last approximately 30 minutes, which means that we cannot clearly cover everything, but the idea is to give you enough to decide whether you actually want to delve deeper into the topic. And we signpost in our presentations further sources of more in-depth information to help you to do that. Next slide, please. So today, while you enjoy your coffee, your tea, or bagel in the next 30 minutes, I'm very excited to say that we are going to hear from Gabriel Castellanos, who leads IRENA's work on the decarbonization of the shipping industry. The industry is very hard to decarbonize, but also vital to our economies, and the sector hasn't been yet extensively covered. Therefore, I'm very happy to say that Gabriel will share with us his key takeaway from a recent IRENA report, which he authored, and which is called The Pathway to Decarbonize the Shipping Sector by 2050. But before I hand over a microphone to Gabriel, just very briefly, a few usual housekeeping items, which you certainly are all aware from all other online events. So we are recording the webinar, and we will post both the recording and the presentation slides on IRENA events website within the next 48 hours. You are on mute, so if you have questions for Gabriel, please use the Q&A function. And don't forget to give us your feedback in the short survey, which will be available after the webinar. Also, please share with us what other topics you would like us to cover. And now, without any further ado, let me welcome Gabriel. Hi, Gabriel. Welcome, and over to you.
Hi, Martina. Thank you very much for the kind presentation, for leading this IRENA Insights webinar series. So thank you very much for everybody as well for being here with us today. As Martina will mention, I will be presenting our recent report, A Pathway to Decarbonize the Shipping Sector by 2050. Overall, this report, this piece of work looks into 4 elements: market dynamics and trends and trade volumes, associated energy demand and CO2 emissions linked to the international shipping sector, the technology readiness and costs of the different energy fuels, of the different renewable energy fuels, the decarbonization pathway by 2050 and its implications, and then we also explore enabling actions to raise the decarbonization ambition. So this, in a nutshell, what this piece of work looks into. To begin with, I think it's very, very important that we acknowledge the relevance and how important it is, the international shipping sector in the global economy. One of the reasons why this sector is so tough to decarbonize is because we cannot rely on this sector lowering its activity, because it will have a direct impact in the global economy. As we can see, the energy demand of this sector is very closely related to the GDP. So on that regard, we can say that energy efficiency, yes, is the low-hanging fruit for decarbonizing this sector, but it has limitations. Of course, as energy efficiency as well, energy efficiency measures are implemented progressively, the nexus between GDP and energy demand will be lower and lower and decouple progressively. Yet, as I mentioned, energy efficiency has limitations in terms of carbon reduction potential if we are to decarbonize this sector deeply or completely by 2050. Overall, if we look at the international shipping sector and how the different the allocation of energy, the voyage-based allocation of energy consumption for international shipping, we can see that most of the emissions and energy consumption is linked to large and very large vessels. Indeed, like 85% of the GHG emissions, of the greenhouse gas emissions of the shipping sector, are concentrated in 20% of the global fleet. So overall, the impact that this sector has in terms of total global emissions is around 3% of total of the global emissions are linked to the shipping sector. So if we make an analogy, if this sector was to be a country, this sector would be the 6th or 7th largest CO2 emitter, so very significant at a global level. Now, there are many pathways that can be explored in order to decarbonize the shipping sector. The one that we explore is a pathway that considers a 70% share of renewable energy fuels, which would allow to cut CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. This would be cutting emissions by 80% by 2050 would be aligned with a 1.5 degrees scenario. We can see here on the right-hand side the difference between the business as usual scenario and the 1.5 scenario, and how the scenario that the IRENA has explored, this pathway, ensures a very, very deep decarbonization that cuts emissions by 80% in comparison to the base year, which is 2018. So overall, in order to achieve this 80% cut in CO2 emissions by 2050, there are 4 elements that will play an important role. One, and the most important one, will be the indirect electrification by employing e-fuels, so ammonia, methanol. These will result in 60% of the reduction of CO2 emissions. 3% of the decarbonization could be achieved by advanced biofuels, and 20% by improving the energy efficiency in vessels through operational and design measures. Now, there are also systemic changes in the global trade dynamics that would play a role in the decarbonization towards 2050, and this will contribute 17% of the decarbonization. So this is the pathway that IRENA has explored, and I will be deep diving into this one. So overall, here we have a chart that is showing us the 1.5 scenario, the energy pathway that IRENA that we have explored here at IRENA, and we can see that in 2020, and historically, the shipping sector has been a sector that relies heavily on heavy fuel oil More recently, since IMO introduced limits in terms of sulfur emissions, very low sulfur oil, and lately LNG, but not much, and just 1% of the 2020 fuel consumption was renewable. That was mostly by advanced biofuels. So very reliant this sector on fossil fuels. Now, the pathway that we are exploring by 2050, we can see that ammonia will represent a big share of the energy mix in 2050, jointly with other renewable fuels, methanol, liquid hydrogen, and advanced biofuels too, but primarily ammonia. Now we are talking about here, well, liquid hydrogen itself, and other green hydrogen derived fuels such as ammonia and methanol. So altogether, the total amount of green hydrogen that would be required for this sector alone is in the range of 46 million tons of green hydrogen for the production of e-fuels. 73% of that green hydrogen would be required for the production of the ammonia, 17% for e-methanol, and 10% to be directly used as liquid hydrogen. Now, what is the challenge that we have ahead of us? If we talk about a share of around 40% of renewable ammonia, that would mean that this sector by 2050 would require around 183 million tons of renewable ammonia by 2050. So in order to understand what's the scale of the challenge, requiring 180 plus million tons of renewable ammonia is equivalent, is comparable to the total amount of renewable ammonia that is produced globally today. So it's an important challenge that we have ahead. Overall, the pathway, let's say, towards from now towards 2050 can be described as follows. In the immediate term, energy efficiency is essential from an operational and design point of view. In the short term, biofuels will play a role, advanced biofuels that come from sustainable feedstocks that are not detrimental for water, in terms of the water supply and food security as well. And then in the medium and long term, that then is when green hydrogen fuels are very important and indeed pivotal for the decarbonization of this key sector of the global economy. Now, one of the reasons why the green hydrogen based fuels are a medium long-term solution is because of their cost, their production cost. Here on this chart, what you can see is a comparison of the different costs, production cost of the different renewable fuel alternatives, liquid biofuels, renewable gaseous fuels, and e-fuels. And also, you can see a comparison between what was the very low sulfur oil market price in 2019 in the lower dotted lines, and the cost of LNG and the market price of LNG in 2019. Now, one thing was the cost, the market price of fossil fuels, let's say in 2019, but what we are seeing today is that if we compare today's market price with the production cost of the majority of renewable fuels are becoming more and more competitive. And on that regard, it's important to acknowledge the volatility of the fossil fuel market, and therefore how the use of renewable fuels can somehow shield the sector and help to de-risk the sector if these are employed. And we can see that if this cost analysis was made in 2020, perhaps let's say the future cost of fuels such as ammonia or methanol was not very competitive. But what we are seeing today is that now, if compared against the market price, it is competitive. Now, of course, there are many things that need to happen in order to enhance further the competitiveness of renewable fuels, particularly those that are pivotal for the decarbonization of the shipping sector, being ammonia and methanol. And we will be discussing and touching on that in the next slides. One of those key measures in order to ensure the competitiveness in terms of production cost of fuels and the supply of those fuels is to identify the geographical location that could fast forward the energy transition in the sector. Here you have a map with the main maritime shipping traffic routes. And it's very important, as I say, that we ensure enough production, enough supply on those strategic points, and therefore why it is important to look at this map of maritime shipping traffic routes. Just to put two examples, the Panama Canal provides access directly to the Atlantic and the Pacific, as we all know, but the Panama Canal reports around 14,000 ship passages that in total transport around 230 million tons of goods. So we have one important location there in terms of trade. But then if we think of Singapore, for instance, Singapore is responsible for nearly 1/4 of the global bunkering supply. To be precise, 22% of the global bunkering is supplied in Singapore. So with these two examples that point at different directions, one in terms of trade relevance and traffic, and the other one in terms of bunkering, just to shed light a bit on the relevance and how important it is to look at the different strategic geographical areas where that could somehow fast forward the decarbonization of the shipping sector. Altogether, it's very important. There's a high need to focus efforts on facilitating investment in these strategic geographical locations. To be more structured and schematic in terms of what needs to be done if we are to decarbonize the shipping sector, and how can we raise ambition in order to achieve 100% decarbonization of this energy sector through 100% renewable energy mix, for instance, by 2050. There are 4 dimensions in which we need to work. One, and very important one, is the to enhance multi-stakeholder synergies. Here, as we are now talking about in the language of green hydrogen, and acknowledging such a cross-cutting sector that the shipping sector is for the global economy and the different productive sectors of the economy, we need to enhance stakeholders need to develop broader business models and establish strategic partnerships. So energy-intensive industries need to work together. For instance, aviation will also be hungry for green hydrogen fuels. Power suppliers also need to be part of the discussion. The petrochemical sector as well, the utilities, the governments. This is very important if we are to achieve the decarbonization of the shipping sector. Partnerships need to be built around with the concise and aiming for coordinated efforts in order to decarbonize the shipping sector and ensure enough supply of renewable fuels. The second one could be described as purely policy-driven actions, and this is basically to enable a level playing field for renewable fuels. We're talking here about carbon levies, for instance, so as well as incentives for renewable fuels, and ensuring the right policies would indeed actually like avoid and prevent a stranded assets dynamic. And this is very important. For instance, if the sector continues to rely on LNG, yet if policies are not clear and push on a different direction, we could be seeing that in the future there's LNG infrastructure that is stranded there. The third one is research, development, and innovation. It's very important to, for instance, to prompt research and development institutions to analyze the upstream dynamics of renewable fuels, including the life cycle analysis of the different fuels and their production costs in different geographical locations. And the fourth one is basically to foster investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency. So this goes in three directions: to aim for the development of carbon zero vessels, support the implementation of retrofits, and support the investing actually in the production of renewable fuels in resource-rich locations. These three actually could be supported by enabling affordable lines of credit. And this would be very important, but the fourth one, as I mentioned, is critical, and this goes around invest and invest and invest in carbon zero vessels, retrofits, and in the production of renewable fuels in order to ensure enough supply. So with this last slide, I'll pass the floor to you, Martina, I think, for the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel, very much. Yeah, pretty hard to decarbonize shipping, we heard, and yeah, but anyway, the positive speed at the end that if there are right plans and sufficient support, it is viable. With the time running out, let me go directly to the questions. So you mentioned that systemic changes in global dynamics have an impact on the decarbonization. Can you please elaborate on that and what does it mean? Thank you.
Thank you, Martina, for the question. So basically what it means here is, like, historically what we've seen is, for instance, cargo ships transporting from one place to another coal or fossil fuel energy commodities. As the world embarks into the energy transition and into the decarbonization of the global economy, not just the shipping sector, but the global economy, let's say many countries are now reducing the amount of coal that they use for power generation purposes. And this means that less trade of coal will happen. So these are the type of systemic changes that somehow would reduce the activity itself of the sector. Similar with other fuels, other fossil fuels, that as the demand of these fossil fuels goes lower, less trade, less transport, less activity of the shipping sector. And this would also have an impact, let's say, reduced emissions due to reduced activity in the transport of certain goods.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions about ammonia as such. So if you can elaborate and give more details on the advantage of e-ammonia compared to e-methanol, hydrogen, and electricity for shipping decarbonization. Thank you.
So, for instance, to point out one very clear advantage of ammonia over methanol is that basically its chemical composition does not have any carbon. For the production of let's say, methanol, one of the key challenges is to acquire sustainable sources of carbon. For instance, one of the path would be via direct air capture. That is still expensive. But eventually the thing is that we still have the CO2 molecule there, let's say, in the chemical composition. So, whereas in ammonia, we don't have any carbon there. So that's one of the advantages, let's say. The other one is like the ease of transporting the ammonia. Now, one of the challenges is in terms of the engine manufacture. Let's say the ammonia engine, as of now, does not exist commercially, but it is being developed, and there's been great advancement on that, as reported by well-known engine manufacturers, and that should be ready in the next year, or as reported by the manufacturers. So it's that's one of the things.
Great. I have another question. It goes, 40% of global shipping is for moving fossil fuels. Considering that this percentage must drop massively in the decarbonization scenario, how does that change IRENA's equation? If you can say anything about that, thanks.
So that circles back to the first question. That is like, yes, indeed, like one of the major goods that are traded or say shipped from one place to another are fossil fuels, and as the world embarks into its decarbonization, these goods will be transported less and less. And as our analysis that is actually in line with IMO 2020 analysis, this will result in a 17% reduction of emissions. I mean, it's an approximation. This is not exact. Let's say there are uncertainties around it. At the same time, for instance, and we need to leave it very clear. We need to acknowledge the uncertainties around the different pathways for decarbonization starting now until 2050. There are uncertainties, and we need to acknowledge that. For instance, yes, one of the fossil fuels are likely to be, let's say, the demand of fossil fuels is likely to be reduced, and therefore reduced trade and ship of fossil fuels. But at the same time, we will see more trade of copper, more trade of like renewable energy equipment, more trade of electrical material, and let's say rare metals. So there are very complex dynamics around this.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Gabriel. Can you tell us how much will the total decarbonization of shipping at 2050 cost? Do you have any estimates?
We did not do numerical calculations here on as part of this piece of work. So I cannot give a precise number, but certainly would be very interesting to then translate all this into costs. So I actually rather take that as a really good, as a very good feedback for future work.
Yeah, thank you. And since we are running out of time, I will just take one more question. Thank you for all the questions. We received plenty of them. So I will share all of them with Gabriel, and he might have the opportunity also to follow up with him, find him on LinkedIn. Anyway, the last question. What do you think about the carbon market in the sector? Will it be important to incentivize decarbonization of the sector? Will it work well in this sector? What do you think? Thank you.
It's really good question. Thank you for that question. Well, let's say leveling, like if we want renewable fuels, especially e-fuels, green hydrogen derived e-fuels, to be competitive, I think it's very important for us to start promoting and to start creating that carbon market. And the way that carbon market can be created is through levies. So that it's very important for this sector actually to ensure that there is an existing, well-structured carbon market out there. That is what will, I think, be one of the main factors that will push for competitive renewable fuels.
Thank you, Gabriel. We are unfortunately running out of our 30 minutes time slot. So I would like to thank again, Gabrielle, for your time and for sharing with us your knowledge and experience with working on shipping decarbonization and also all the challenges that lies ahead of the sector. And I would also like to thank all of you for joining us today, for listening, and for all your very, very good questions. As I said, I will share them with Gabriel. Please find him on LinkedIn. You can reach out to him directly. I hope that's okay. And anyway, we hope that you learn a lot from this presentation. And if I can just ask for a next slide, and actually I think two. What comes next? We are planning already a series of webinars. In our next webinar in 2 weeks, we will heard about pattern and standards and what role they play when it comes to deployment of renewables. And then we will have a webinar in a month about geopolitics, and it will focus on hydrogen. The registration to all these webinars are already open, and we hope to see you in one of those webinars again. And then in the survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar, you can share with us comments about what other topics you would like to hear. So that is all from us today. I again want to thank Gabrielle and all of you for joining us today. I wish you a great rest of the day. Goodbye and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Martina, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. Bye-bye.